So I'll just read one pasuk to begin. What David HaMelech says after Avner ben Ner is killed. Va'anochi hayom rach u'mashuach melech v'ha'anashim ha'ele b'nei Seruya kashim mimeni yishalem Adonai le'oseh hara'a kira'ato. So David HaMelech calls this b'nei Seruya him kashim mimeni. They're harsher than me, or they're more difficult than me, or they're tougher than me, right? They're more kashem mimeni, and we know that David HaMelech pays a hefty price for his inability to deal with Bnei Seruya. And there is this very difficult relationship that happens between Yoav, Avishai, Yoav's brother, and David HaMelech. And in order to understand that, we need to understand a little bit about the Malchut of David, what it is based on. And when we do that, we'll understand the aspects of Yoav, what they represent, towards that Malchut and that relationship with David. So I think the first thing to realize about Malchut with David is that as it begins, the very foundations of the Malchut is Hesed. And that is the key element of David HaMelech. And I'll begin by reading from Perek Bet, Pasuk Dalet. ויבואו אנשי יהודה וימשחו שם את דוד למלך על בית יהודה ויגידו לדוד לאמור אנשי יבש גלעד אשר קברו את שאול וישלח דוד מלאכים אל אנשי יבש גלעד. His first action as king is to send messengers to יבש גלעד. ויאמר עליהם ברוכים אתם לאדוני אשר עשיתם החסד הזה עם אדוניכם. You've done a great chesed with Shaul. עם שאול ותקברו אותו ועתה יעש אדוני עמכם חסד ואמת. השם שיפי you את החסד. וגם אנוכי אעשה אתכם הטובה הזאת אשר עשיתם הדבר הזה ועתה תחזקנה ידיכם והיו לבני חיל כי מת אדוניכם שאול וגם אותי משחו בית יהודה למלך עליהם. So he extends himself to Yavesh Gilad, who would seem to be clearly an enemy or a potential adversary, but he extends himself for this concept and this motif of Hesed. Of course, we know that this idea that David HaMelech wanted to rule peacefully amongst all factions didn't work out. And it didn't work out because of the actions of two people, right? Avner, and we'll see later, even Yoav had something to do with it. So, but we'll talk about that. But it's clear that David HaMelech seems to be a malchut that values Hesed. We know already twice with Shaul that David HaMelech showed what we'll call Lifnim Mishurat Hadin, this value of Hesed, that he had the ability to kill Shaul and he didn't kill Shaul. We see that with Shim'i ben Gera, right? He extends Hesed, right? He had the right to kill him immediately on the spot, but he didn't. We also see that the way he deals with Ishboshet and Avner, his enemies, in both of those cases, when they are killed, David HaMelech is not happy about it. He accepts Avner, and he attempts to make a peace treaty. And of course, we know that he makes a hesped and tremendous mourning for Avner as well as for Ishboshet. I would say one of the greatest acts of Hesed that David HaMelech begins his Malchut is in Perek Tet. Perek Tet, and we'll talk about the story for a few minutes because this is interesting because it's a story that interrupts all of the beginning, all of the beginning of Malchut David, with a personal story. And we have to say, I think we're up to Perek Yud today, correct, Jesse, am I right? So that's interesting because I would say Perakim Aleph to Yud in Shmuel Bet, we will call the height of Malchut Bet David. In other words, if I can break up Shmuel Bet into at least two parts, Aleph to Yud is David on his highest form. Of course, we know things radically change in Perek Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, then everything is, then you have Yud Gimel, which leads to a tremendous tragedy, and then it leads to Mered Avshalom. In other words, everything descends from there for the rest of Malchut Bet David. But in these Perakim, we see David in his height. In his height militarily, in his height dealing with different factions of Am Yisrael, and in Perek Tet, in his height personally. So, I don't have to go over the whole story. You all just read it yesterday. And we know that David HaMelech seeks out if anyone's left to Bet Shaul, so that he should perform with him what? Ve'eseh imo Hesed. You're going to see the term Hesed continuously comes. David seeks out Hesed. Right? So the term Hesed, remember David, Achi yesh od asher notar lebet Shaul ve'eseh imo Hesed ba'avur Yonatan. And now, there's a story, right? And who lives, Bet Shaul, Eved u'shmo Siva. There's this Eved. And he says, yeah. So he says, he asks Siva, ha'efes od ish lebet Shaul, ve'eseh imo Hesed. Is there anybody? V'yomer Siva, od ben leYonatan necher raglayim. Yeah, there's one necher raglayim. He doesn't even give him, who, where? He's avoiding the question. So, yeah, od ben necher raglayim. Right? V'yomer lech, efo hu? Where is he? Vayomer Siva LaMelech, hinehu bet mechir ben Amiel be'lo davar. So now the king, David has to, on his own. Siva is not helpful. Vayomer HaMelech David, vayikaheu mibet mechir ben Amiel be'lo davar, vayavo Mephibosheth ben Shaul. Now, of course, Mephibosheth's pretty scared about this meeting, and he says, "Hine avdecha vayomer al tira." Ki aso eseh ima hesed ba'avur Yonatan avicha, and I am going to return to you all the sadeh of Shaul. And what do you mean you have to return the sadeh? Where is the sadeh? So some of the Mefarshim, Radak and others say that David HaMelech himself was Yoresh that sadeh. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. Others say, and I think more plausible, close to the Peshat, that who was in possession of the sadeh that David HaMelech has to return it to Mephibosheth? Siva himself. Now watch what happens. Vayomer HaMelech el Siva nara Shaul, vayomer elav kol asher yesh Shaul beto natati leben adonecha. This is the son of your master. I'm giving. Va'avadta lo et hadama ata ubanecha va'avadecha. You will worship. והיה לבן אדונך לחם ואכלו ומפיבושת בן אדונך יאכל תמיד לחם על שולחני. He will eat, says David, bread on my table. ולציווה 15 בנים ו20 עבדים. The Eved has 20. Where do you get that from? And why are we introducing that point? We'll see. Now watch Siva's answer. ויאמר ציווה למלך ככל יצווה אדוני המלך את עבדו כן יעשה. I'll do whatever you want. כן יעשה עבדך. Oh, by the way, ומפיבושת אוכל על שולחני כאחד מבני המלך. So how interesting is this? We find now that Siva is telling David HaMelech that this is unnecessary because Mephibosheth could eat on my table. You're the Eved, the Ben Necher Raglayim, who can't stand up for himself, is now being supported by the Eved, so to speak. So, of course, what happens is David HaMelech writes this rule. Now, if we have any doubt how corrupt Siva was, you just need to go later on and you'll find that Siva uses the merit of Avshalom to speak evil against Mephibosheth and to convince David that he is on the side of David, Siva, but that Mephibosheth is on the side of Avshalom. And it works. Initially, David HaMelech gives the whole sadeh to Siva, and then eventually Mephibosheth defends himself, and he gives half, and he splits the sadeh. But that's another episode. And over there, Hazal are highly critical of David HaMelech, right? Misha'a she'amar David HaMelech אתה וציווה יחלוקו סתזה יצא בת קול ואמרה רחבעם וירבעם יחלוקו את המלכות. Consider that midah k'neged midah. So but that's not here, and that's post Perikut. That's when things don't go so well. But here, David HaMelech shines perfectly. He takes the downtrodden Mephibosheth from his adversary's lineage, seeks them out to do hesed, and rights a wrong that seems to be that the Eved has usurped everything, and the actual crippled Ben is being taken advantage of, and David HaMelech rights that wrong. By the way, the next Perek, just another example of David HaMelech as a Isha Hesed. Perek Yod. ויהי אחרי כן וימות מלך בן עמון וימלוך חנון בנו תחתיו ויאמר דוד אעשה חסד עם חנון בן נחש כאשר עשה אביו עמדי חסד. I want to repay. הכרת הטוב. חסד. That's very, very much what David HaMelech's Malchut is about. הכרת הטוב and חסד. We saw it before the Malchut with Shaul. We see it with Anshe Yavesh Gad in the beginning. We see it by Siva. We see it by this Hanun ben Nahash, or it doesn't work out exactly like he thought. We will see it as he dies. He will tell Shlomo HaMelech that Barzilai Giladi should be Achluki. They did for me a hesed, you have to pay. Then back to this concept of doing hesed, this concept also of Hakarat HaTov is throughout. By the way, we're going to reserve this for next week, but I'll say one thing. In his worst moment, David HaMelech also performs Hesed. Post the situation with Bathsheba, right? Uriah Hitti, the whole situation. And it's clear, he doesn't kill Uriah because he wants to marry Bathsheba. That's not, we'll talk about that a little later, but the fact that he takes Bathsheba and marries her shows some level of understanding of some level of responsibility towards his actions. As opposed to whom? As opposed to Amnon, who when he does it, and Tamar is, unlike Bathsheba, Tamar is forcibly raped and protests, and then she asks to be wed, and Amnon throws her out. David HaMelech doesn't go that route, and that's in his worst moment. So this concept of David HaMelech being Isha Hesed is all over the place throughout the Nevi, and that is something that's very characteristic within the Peshat of the text of Malchut David. Right? By the way, that also might be a little bit of his Malchut in Yerushalayim. He sets up a Malchut in Yerushalayim, he removes it from Hebron. Why Yerushalayim? Yerushalayim is in what Shevet? Binyamin, really. To remove it from Shevet Yehuda and Hebron is a risky move. To put it in Binyamin, or close to Binyamin, or half of Binyamin, whatever it was, shows a tremendous amount of moving towards the adversarial shevet. And by the way, Anshe Yehuda don't easily forgive him for this. He has problems with Anshe Yehuda later on. Avshalom, remember, where does he start his rebellion? Hebron, which we'll see later. So the Anshe Yehuda are not so forgiving of this move, right? That they lose their favorite status. But David HaMelech sees himself as a ruler of all of Am Yisrael. That's why he extends himself consistently to the people who you might consider his adversaries, and he pays a hefty price. As I began, we go back to Bnei Tzeruya. David HaMelech says they are kashim mimeni. We'll talk about what that word kashim mimeni means a little bit, but David HaMelech pays a price for that. David HaMelech loses his hope for a peaceful beginning to his malchut because of the actions of Yoav. And we will see that it haunts him throughout at some point, his inability to rein in Bnei Tzeruya. And till the day he dies, he feels responsible for that. And he consistently says tries to divorce himself from that. But till the day of his death, and even until Shlomo HaMelech has Yoav killed, finally he says, I have cleansed my father's responsibility for Yoav. Meaning that link weighs heavy on David. Now, I mentioned that we want to talk about David versus Yoav. So I would like to go back on some of these situations and see some of the conflicts between David and Yoav, or David, more appropriately, let's say we'll call it, and Bnei Tzeruya. So the first conflict is obvious. It's way back in Shmuel Aleph, right? When David HaMelech wants to spare the life of Shaul, it is Avishai who says, no, we have to kill him. He says, and if you refuse to kill him, I'll kill him. And, of course, David HaMelech refuses, and he extends this act of hesed towards Shaul. If he would kill Shaul, it would be very hard to blame him, right? Shaul is in pursuit of him. One could say that maybe Al Pidin, maybe Shaul had a din of Rodef at that point, and David HaMelech, in order to defend himself, might have been justified to kill him. But nevertheless, David HaMelech goes beyond that, and it is Avishai who wants to deal with what seems to be just plain out diner here. He's going after you. Let me kill him. He's your enemy. God put him in your hands. It's enough. And of course, David refuses. And then he uses the same lashon, Bnei Tzeruya. A similar situation with Avishai comes in later in Shmuel Bet, where Avishai says also, I want you to kill this person, and David refuses. Anyone know who that is? Shimei ben Gera. Shimei ben Gera, it's Avishai who says, you should kill him. And again, David HaMelech refuses with very similar lashon. Take a look, the lashon in both places is very similar. So we see that right away in every time that David HaMelech attempts to go beyond, to extend his hesed, so to speak, which would be very characteristic of his malchut, it is right away in those two cases, Avishai, and we'll see Yoav also, opposes or sort of acts or attempts to thwart that move. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about the very beginning, because I mentioned that we know that Yoav is somebody who makes it difficult for David to rule Bishalom. I started by saying that David HaMelech extends himself to Yavesh Gilad, and he hopes to have a malchut over everybody, but it doesn't work out the way he planned. Why doesn't it work out the way he planned? Well, the first person that we would blame, which is the most obvious person to blame, really, is Avner ben Ner, because he is Mamlich Ish Boshet. Now, It's a very serious thing. Why is it so serious? Because we know that Avner knows what he's doing is in the violation of the will of God. How do we know that by Avner being mamlich itzboshet, that he knows that he's violating the will of God? What? Because when he says, when he gets angry at Ishboshet and he makes a pact with David, he says, "Ko yaseh Elohim la'Avner v'cho Yosif." No. Ki ka'asher nishba Adonai leDavid ki chen e'eseh lo. So, by him being mamlich Ishboshet, it's clear he is openly violating what he understands is the word of God. That's a severe thing that Avner did. So he is mamlich Ishboshet. No doubt he considers that maybe his attempt, he'll have power. And what happens? There's a battle in Giv'on. And Ishboshet goes further. And Yoav ben Tzruya v'avdei David yatzu v'yifkishum al birkat Giv'on yahtav v'yeshbu el al abrecha mizeh ve'el abrecha mizeh v'yomer Avner el Yoav Avner says yakumu na'arim v'yisahaku lefanenu. V'yomer Av yakumu. What do you mean yakumu na'arim v'yisahaku lefanenu? Meaning let them fight. And the Midrash also here accuses Avner of a very harsh thing. Why was Avner killed? Because he viewed the battle and the lives of his Ne'arim as a mishak. Yisahaku lefanenu. And of course, we know in this battle of Giv'on, David and Melech seems to win. They kill 360 men of Binyamin, and of David and Melech's forces, 19 die, but plus 19 plus Asael, Yoav's brother, at the hands of Avner. Now, however, something's funny. This is a battle that seems to be started by Avner. Later on, ויקרא אבנר אל יואב ויום הנצח תאכל חרב, הלא ידעתי כי מרה תהיה באחרונה, ועד מתי לא תאמר לעם לשוב מאחרי אחיכם? Why are you starting a civil war? Now, that's strange. Avner seems to start it. ויאמר יואב, and Yoav answers, אלוהים כי לא דיברת, כי אז מהבוקר נעלה העם איש מאחרי אחיו. You did it. You not spoken, we would not have had a war. What is Avner complaining about to Yoav? Well, it seems that Yoav, by showing up at Giv'on, that's a tremendous provocation. Giv'on is way into the area of Binyamin, meaning he's going in clearly far into enemy territory. So while Avner is responsible, Yoav bears a certain responsibility for this war also. And that's why Avner says that. Otherwise, what's Avner talking about? Having said that, having seen that there's an equal responsibility to Yoav and Avner for this battle, and that Avner does blame Yoav, we see that really David HaMelech's plan of a peaceful melucha is thwarted not just, which is most obviously by the actions of Avner, but even by the actions of his own general Yoav. Now that's also clear after Avner is forced to kill, right, Asael, right, and he clearly gives Asael ways out, but Asael refuses, and Avner kills Asael, and then Avner comes to David for a peace treaty, and Yoav does what? Yoav accuses Avner of being what? Of being a spy. Now, it's very clear we know the text that Yoav is lying. How do we know that Yoav is lying? Because later it says, the pasuk is very clear, because after Yoav kills Avner, v'Yoav Avishai ahiv hargu Avner al asher hamit et Asael ahem begivon b'milchama. It's clear. The text is telling you there was a clear agenda here. It had nothing to do with them not trusting Avner's intentions. Avner, nobody even thought that he was a spy, but rather for their own personal agenda, and maybe justified, right? With the law of Goel Hadam, maybe it is justified. I don't know. But nevertheless, from their own personal agenda, they thwart again David HaMelech's attempt at the performance of Hesed, at the performance of getting together and avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, right? And of course, that's something that Yoav will also give his life up for. That will cost Yoav. That action will eventually cost Yoav his own life. So we see that Yoav and Avishai, the Bnei Siruya, are linked, diametrically opposed to David HaMelech in their attempts to have Hesed. They come with Din, they come with harshness, Kashim. They are Kashim more than David. When David attempts to be magnanimous, when David attempts to use Hesed in all of these situations, it becomes Yoav that refuses. And it becomes Bnei Siruya that thwart that plan. Now, there are times, like in the case initially of killing Shaul, or the case of Shimi ben Gera, when David HaMelech is able to overcome that. But, as we saw here in the beginning, in the situation with Avner and the situation with the battle against Ishbosheth, Avner's harsher approach outweighs David's more magnanimous approach, and David HaMelech is left to do nothing but to cry, to mourn, and to actually tell the people that it's not him, right? So there is this tension between Yoav and David, and again, it will never be resolved David's entire life. But I think we'd be oversimplifying it to leave it at that, because there are times, and here is what complicates the matter, where it is where things work the opposite. That there are times where David HaMelech's bad choices are contrasted with Yoav's good choices. Okay? And so that's important to understand. It usually happens in battle, and it usually happens when David HaMelech, although not all the time, when David HaMelech seems to be paralyzed by some level of inaction. So, we're told that there's a war with Ammon. And this Nahash HaEmoni, David decides to do a Hesed im Hanun ben Nahash. Hesed. But this act of Hesed is misplaced. As we see, Hanun ben Nahash is not a worthy recipient of David's Hesed, and we don't even know what the good that Nahash Melech Ammon did for David. Hochma HaMidrash say that when he put all his family in Moab, Melech Moab killed them all. One of them escaped to Ammon, and that escapee to Ammon was protected. But that's nowhere within the Peshat. We don't know what the Hesed of Nahash Melech Ammon did for David. We do know, however, that he was a pretty nasty fellow when it came to Anshe Yavesh Gilad, and he was really certainly ready to force them into humiliation, right? So, however, what happens is this leads to a war, right? Now, it's very tempting sometimes to see the chain of events by David HaMelech to say, oh, what if this didn't happen, right? So if they never went to war with Ammon, and if, therefore, there was no war with Ammon, so there would be no battle, and so if there was no war with Ammon, then Uriah Hittite would have never gone into battle, and if Uriah Hittite would have never gone into battle, then what would happen? Then there would be no David and Bathsheba story, and if there was no David and Bathsheba story, there would be no Amnon and Tamar story, and if there was no Amnon and Tamar story, there would be no Mered Avshalom. Right? So, it's very tempting to do that, but That's not accidental. Everything seems to be connected because David HaMelech makes a crucial miscalculation. And Melech ben Ammon sends his shlichim back humiliated. And then there's a battle. Now I'd like to break up the battle into three parts. There's battle one. Who goes into the first battle, right? So, into the first battle, so we'll talk about, right, so there's this battle with Ammon, and Ammon unites a whole group of kings, Aram Soba, and they all unite together, milhama, against David. And who fights this first battle? Yoav takes control of this battle. So again, watch what happens. David maybe went a little too far with the hesed. He miscalculated. And who's there to right the wrong? Yoav. And Yoav shines here. The Lashon of Yoav is a very famous statement. Because now they have a two-pronged battle and they have to split up. And he tells his brother, Hazak v'nithazek ba'ad amenu u'ba'ad arei Elohenu v'Adonai ya'aseh tov be'enav. Right? Divine force. Vayigash Yaakov v'am asher imo b'milchama ba'aram v'yanus mipanav. Right? And so what happens is the first battle seems to end in some victory, but not fully. Vayar ki nigaf b'nei Yisrael yasu yahad. Right? So they try again. And then there's battle number 2. Right? And this battle, Vayavor et Yarden v'yavor halema vayarchu Aram likrat David v'yalahamu imo. Vayanas Aram b'nei Yisrael v'yarog David me'aram 700 rechev v'arba'im parashim b'tshobach sasabo hika v'yamut sham. This is David. Battle 2 is in the hands of, against Aram. Only now. It's no Ammon, just Aram. David HaMelech does battle. And everybody is fine with it. And then what happens? There's another battle. In Perek Yud Aleph Pasuk Aleph. Vayhi l'tshuvat hashana le'etzet hamlachim vayishla David et Yoav et avadav imo v'kol Yisrael v'yashchitu et pnei Ammon v'yasuru al Rabbah v'David yoshev b'Yerushalayim. The third battle, go back to Ammon. Here, what happens? David is yoshev b'Yerushalayim. Yoav is fighting, and David is yoshev b'Yerushalayim. So again, here we have, at some point now, Yoav filling in very important gaps. Now, the text says David Yoshev Yerushalayim. Why does it? Obviously it's in Yerushalayim. No, because it sets up the problem, right? David is Yoshev Yerushalayim. David is sort of being metayel on his roof. David is in relaxed mode. And that whole episode later with Uriah, how could I sit back while my brothers are fighting? That's sort of a rebuke to David because David is sitting back, right? So you find the case all of a sudden here where Yoav is shining and David's sort of inaction or lack of ability to take control of the situation that gap is filled by Yoav. And that's important to see because all of a sudden here it's David's fault and Yoav steps up to the plate. Again, right? Yoav is the one, battle 1 and battle 3, that you'd expect after David blow against Aram, okay, now he'd finish situation against what? Against Ammon. But that's not what happens. David Yoshev b'Yerushalayim. So it's an important idea to understand that Yoav also has times where he actually serves as almost an anti-David foil for the good. One or two other examples. In the story of Bathsheba, when Yoav is commanded to sort of sacrifice Uriah, to have him put in the battle and everyone back up, right? That's what he gives to Yoav. Yoav doesn't exactly do that, right? Yoav doesn't do that. Yoav doesn't sacrifice Uriah. What Yoav does do, because David commanded, in other words, so he sends them Uriah with other people. They don't abandon Uriah. They send him on a dangerous mission. Maybe a suicide mission. And Uriah, as well as others, perish in that. But Uriah is not sacrificed. Yoav is too sharp of a general to set that precedent and and destroy the morale of his soldiers by just abandoning a soldier on a battlefield. It may cost him other soldiers too to fulfill David's mission. But that is Yoav. Yoav, in the nadir of David HaMelech's career, doesn't follow suit. There are other times. We know, We know, of course, in the situation with Avshalom, in the beginning and in the end, Yoav is the one who is giving calculated advice to David HaMelech. Right? David HaMelech's dealing with Avshalom. David HaMelech setting him, sort of almost exiling him. It is Yoav who gets him back. David HaMelech brings him back, but then doesn't talk to him, which is sort of like the worst of both worlds. You bring him back out of exile, and then don't connect with him, don't communicate with him. And of course, Avshalom makes the mistake of his career by making an enemy out of Yoav and burning his fields. And it was Yoav who was trying to speak on his behalf, and of course that will eventually cost him his life, because that you don't make an enemy out of Yoav needlessly. As shrewd as Avshalom is, that's probably the... And of course, at the end of the battle, when David again is paralyzed by his personal grief for his son Avshalom, it is Yoav that tells him, stop, you are the king, go out. So there are times where David HaMelech, through his, maybe we'll call it this excess hesed, is paralyzed from action. Right? And it is at that point that Yoav steps up to the plate. We even know, and this situation is a little different, and I'm not really going to deal with this one because I'm going to leave this towards the end, because this is not David being overly hesed or paralyzed and Yoav stepping up to the plate. At the end and the last perek of Shmuel Bet is where David HaMelech decides he's going to count Am Yisrael. Why? We'll leave for a later time. It is Yoav who attempts to say, you can't do this. This is a sin. It's wrong. Clearly, Yoav is right, and a Magefa and whatever. But the point is, over there as well, when David HaMelech has a fall, so to speak, it is Yoav who's there to do the right thing. So you find throughout Sefer Shmuel Bet that you have David HaMelech. It's almost that whenever David HaMelech is doing something good, Yoav is doing something bad. Whenever David HaMelech is not doing the best, then Yoav is doing good. It's almost the exact opposite of where David is at each point. And I would think the message is this. I would think the message is that David HaMelech wants a malchut based on hesed. And that's his goal. And that's clearly how he sets himself up from the very beginning. And Yoav is an impediment to that. Yoav doesn't understand that. Yoav consistently, ruthlessly opposes a lot of that hesed. And part of that is when David HaMelech wants to extend himself, a hakarat hatov, to his adversaries, it is Yoav who refuses. By the way, the one case where we didn't mention, which is a similar situation, which is after the Mered of Avshalom, David HaMelech hires a former adversary to be on his thing, and that is the famous Amasa. And what happens? Yoav eventually kills him. Yoav doesn't have that ability to extend his hand to his adversaries. And Yoav thwarts the plans of David HaMelech to perform that chesed. And so that's part of what Yoav's doing. But a malchut of chesed itself has its potential dangers and pitfalls. And that pitfall is that it may have lacked certain structure and it can be overextended inappropriately at different times. And we see that happens. We see that happens. And David HaMelech, and that causes David HaMelech to make mistakes, either because he becomes somewhat paralyzed from action, or it is because he just, for a moment, forgets the appropriate time and place that deen brings with it. Hesed sometimes creates an ability for a person to forget exactly the appropriateness of actions, right? Zenut is called in the Torah Hesed in a certain sense, because why? Because Hesed sometimes lacks the structure of what's appropriate at what time the deen brings with it. And so there are times where the Hesed of David HaMelech, the ability to perform Hesed, is misplaced. And it is at those times that Yoav's deen shines forward in the appropriateness and saying, this is not appropriate now. You're not to cry for Avshalom at this moment. That doesn't work at this point, correct? That can't happen, right? Sending messengers to Nahash's son as to do Hesed, that's just not appropriate. That's an enemy. And Yoav will fight that enemy, right? So there are times where David HaMelech's inaction or inappropriate actions are met with the appropriate actions by Yoav. The one exception to when David is the counting where David does wrong, not through Hesed at all. It's just wrong, and Yoav is the one who's doing right. That's a little bit of a different case. We'll talk about that when we come closer toward the end of Shmuel Bet. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned how the story with Uriah and Bathsheba was not necessarily David trying to marry Bathsheba, rather just it was his marriage with Bathsheba was more of a chesed. How do we see that from the text?
So again, probably next week, I'm going to see. I'm announcing the topic for next week. We'll probably deal. It probably was obvious anyway. We'll probably deal with the David and Bathsheba story within the text of the Pshat. What I'm trying to say is, we will deal with David HaMelech, and I'm not trying to, he killed Uriah, and he killed Uriah for clear reasons. The text never shows that he kills Uriah because he wants to marry Bathsheba. The text shows he wants Bathsheba, he takes Bathsheba, and he wants Uriah to go home. And that should be his wife. His intention was not to kill Uriah so that he can marry Bathsheba. His intention was to send Uriah home, and that story should be forgotten. Now, Uriah doesn't play ball, so then he does that. Now, Uriah's dead. Now he could just throw Bathsheba out and just forget about her. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. So I'm saying it's the worst moment in his career. It's the worst moment. Sometimes you find in the worst moments that trace of even the good quality that he had shine through by tempering that action that he did. So, we will talk about the different natures within the Peshat of what's happening. We'll analyze Hazal as well in different places. of how they look at David and Bathsheba. That's not what I wanted to do here. All I wanted to show here was that is actions of hesed and responsibility and things like that come throughout, even at that moment. Any other questions? Okay.